Hi, I would like to speak today about Father John Brenner, or János in Hungarian. Father John Brenner was a Hungarian Cistercian who was born in 1931 and lived until he was martyred in 1957 under communist persecution. Father John Brenner is a very important light for my own monastery here in Dallas. He was a member of the congregation of Zierts, which is the mother house of our monastery here in Dallas, and he was a very heroic young priest who lived with such great zeal and self-sacrifice, love for the Sacred Heart of Jesus, that he inspires us still today. His relics are with us and they inspire us. We also have a beautiful icon here, which I'll speak about over the course of this little talk. Father John Brenner was born in 1931, and he was born to very devout Catholic parents. His father, Joseph, had grown up as one of 10 children. His own parents were very devout, and he was raised in the faith. Joseph, when he raised John, was someone who tried to go to daily Mass, monthly confession, to participate in the devotions of his local parish. Even when communist authorities made religious participation something that was socially punished, Joseph would willingly take his missal with him to work, his missal that he used at Mass to follow the prayers and the readings, and he would place it on his desk confidently, not afraid to let it be known that he was a practicing Catholic. János had two brothers, an older and a younger. All three became priests. And one day, again during the time of communist persecution, when it was known that two of Joseph's sons, at least, were becoming priests, Joseph was criticized. He said, "Joseph, how could you let two of your sons become priests?" And he calmly and proudly replied, "Actually, three of my sons." So again, he was not afraid to let it be known in peaceful ways where he stood. Joseph was also a big reader. John Brenner grew up in a house full of books. Joseph read a lot, and he encouraged his children to read. Of course, he would always read first whatever books he encouraged his young children to read, to be sure that all that was filling their imagination was edifying and constructive for a life of virtue. Blessed John Brenner's mother, Juliana, was also a wonderful person. She too grew up in a large family. This as one of 12 children, however. She was known as being a very kind woman, a very generous woman, who even in times of great poverty during the communist persecution would always try her best to meet the needs of others. She was known as someone who was very personable, who always had a good word directed to the individual in front of her, very attentive. She also tried to go to daily Mass, and she also tried to participate in the devotions of her local parish. She and her husband, of course, being married, family people, probably couldn't do everything all the time, and I suspect they didn't let their consciences nag them about such things. But they did try out of love and devotion to do what they can, and by God's gift, they were able to do quite a bit. Blessed John Brenner was a very, very precocious child, very intelligent, loved studies, and he was known as a good student throughout his life. When he was very, very young, he played a part in a play at his school. He was the role Tarcisius. That is, he played the part of an early Roman martyr, a little boy who was killed while bringing the Eucharist to Christians in prison. This role turns out to be very prophetic, because the way in which Blessed John Brenner was martyred was very similar to Tarcisius. In fact, one modern biography calls him a modern Tarcisius. Blessed John Brenner spent time at different schools. His family had to move several times during the war in order to escape the bombs and all the sorts of difficult things that come with war. But for a time, he was at a Cistercian school in a city called Pécs, P-E-C-S. And he loved his time at that Cistercian school. One of the things he loved was the unstructured but supervised time that the Cistercian school would provide to their students, a kind of long recess, opportunity for athletics. He loved sports. He loved how the Cistercian schools organized a Cistercian Olympics, where the several Cistercian schools in the country would gather all their students together and compete in different athletic games. He also appreciated the spiritual care that the men and women at the Cistercian schools, and particularly the Cistercian monks, provided for their students. He liked to pursue the faith and to pursue his studies within the culture of the faith. One significant witness from Blessed John's childhood is Dalma Madl. Dalma Madl was the First Lady of Hungary from 2000 to 2005. And she knew Blessed John Brenner when they were young children, at the age of 12. And she testifies to Blessed John Brenner's happiness, his intelligence, and his desire, even at that young age, to become a Cistercian. As World War II drags on, the Brenner family has to move. They move to Szombathely and then into Austria to escape the bombings, and eventually back into Hungary. And by the time the war ends, they are finally settled once again back in their original home in Szombathely. Now, after the war, the communists take over the government of Hungary. And they start very, very quickly to persecute the church. Any totalitarian regime, any regime that wants to dominate the lives of its peoples, will seek to eradicate their awareness of what is transcendent. If human beings know the reality of God and are able to respond to God, then they will, in that very moment, relativize every human authority around them. And the communist authorities who didn't want to be relativized sought, therefore, to persecute the church. One major act of persecution took place in 1948, when the communist government secularized all the schools in Hungary. Some 6,500 plus schools were taken over by the government at that time. The Cistercian Order lost all of its schools at that time. The monks were no longer allowed to teach, and the curriculum was taken over by the government, and religious instruction was no longer possible. Only 8 religious schools were allowed to remain out of over 6,000. Also in 1948, the famous Cardinal Mindszenty was arrested and brought to the place in which he was tortured for 40 days, Andrássy 60, which is a place in Budapest that used to serve as the house of the secret police, both for the Nazis and for the communists. After being tortured for 40 days, he was put on a show trial and condemned to life imprisonment for alleged seditious activities against the government. But of course, his seditious activity was simply being a Catholic prelate. Mindszenty was for a time released during the 1956 Hungarian Revolution. When the revolution failed and the communists took over once again, he sought asylum in the American embassy in Budapest until 1971. These pressures and others were applied to the Hungarian episcopacy to try to persuade them to give allegiance to the new constitution of Hungary. After the schools were secularized, Blessed János Brenner realized that he could not pursue his faith and his studies together, insofar as the schools were now hostile to his faith. In fact, in his biography, there's an anecdote about how he submitted an essay in which he mentioned the soul and spoke about its health and well-being. His teacher, now an atheist, propaganda tool of the communist government, gave him a failing grade and mocked him for his belief in the reality of the human soul, that each one of us has a spiritual constitution, a free human being, an intellect capable of knowing what is beyond the material. János saw that he couldn't pursue his faith and his studies together at such a school, and so he made the sacrifice of joining his brother and other students who had participated at a new program at the monastery of Zeerts, the abbey that is the mother house of our monastery here in Dallas. Abbot Wendel, the abbot president of the congregation and the abbot of Zeerts, had wanted to open up a new program such that students who wanted to continue their formation in the faith and in their studies could do so, even if they were not able to grant any degrees, because once again, such schools had been outlawed. János and others went to Zeerts and enjoyed a very beautiful common life there, basically as oblates, young men who would consider the life of the monk. They would wake up, they would have common prayer, they would have breakfast and mass, they would study, have classes, they would have sport, and they would have private study and quiet time, and then bed. A very regular and peaceful life of growth that János enjoyed tremendously. The zeal that János had for his intellectual life and for the culture of the faith makes me feel that I personally, and we all here in the United States and any free country throughout the world, ought to be tremendously grateful for the intellectual freedom that we enjoy, for the religious freedom that we enjoy, the opportunity to cultivate the highest aspirations of our humanity. Just a little while later, in August of 1950, Blessed János decides that he wants to enter the novitiate and become a Cistercian monk. And so he joins a class of 18 young men who in the middle of persecution wanted to give their lives away to such a noble endeavor. He happily joins and unfortunately is only able to spend 2 months in the monastery before the communist government formally suppresses all the religious orders. But before that took place, Blessed János was able to make a retreat as a novice and write in his journal some very beautiful words of self-offering to God. With the greatest thanks and love of my heart, I thank you for this very, very big grace, that you have called me to your service. Grant that my life always be worthy of my vocation, and that I become holy, because I want to give you everything immediately and without reservation. These are beautiful words of self-offering, and would that we all could say them and mean them and give our lives over to God completely. When the monasteries were disbanded by the communist government, the monks and the nuns were no longer allowed to live in common, to pray together, to wear their habit, or give any official sign of their identity. Those who tried to continue the life had to do so underground. Abbot Wendel was soon arrested and himself tortured and put on a show trial in order to discredit him and the church. The man who assumed authority by Abbot Wendel's delegation was the novice master of Father Lawrence Sigmund. Father Lawrence organized the novices and young monks still in formation into small little bands and sent many of them to live in the homes of sympathetic faithful, many of them in Budapest, where in groups of 2 or 3, the young secret monks would try to pursue their formation by taking theology classes, by attending local universities, if possible, entering diocesan seminaries, which for the time were still allowed to run. And in this way, János too was able to continue his formation, although without the regular life that the monastery provided. This has remained an inspiration for many of the monks here in Dallas, that János and his contemporaries remained monks interiorly, despite the external persecution, despite all the limitations that existed upon the manifestation of their life outwardly. I think this is a good model of asceticism for any Christian, that we ought to remember that the interior life is an interior life. And no matter what our circumstances might be, it is always possible to grow in faith, hope, and love, to persevere in following God's will, whatever circumstances providence allows to condition us. János remained a monk, always wanting to obey God, to live for the sake of the community to which he had entrusted his life. We can do the same, no matter what circumstances we face. These young monks rarely met in groups larger than 4 or 5. Sometimes there would be little events organized for them, but these would be very, very secret events. An elderly member of this community here in Dallas, who has since passed away, I once heard recount in tears of gratitude and tears of, I'm sure, immensely beautiful memories of a time when he was instructed by Father Lawrence to go to a little secret destination in the woods, get off at the bus here, go a certain distance there, make a right, go into the woods at this point, in order to find a secret encounter of adoration of the Holy Eucharist, where this monk and his brothers could pray together before the Eucharist. Such opportunities, however, were rare because they didn't want to run the risk of having the whole operation caught. Father Lawrence, whenever he wrote any notes down, would always tear them up immediately after they had served their purpose, throw them into the river, lest if he were arrested, any written documentation could be found upon him that would incriminate the others in the network. 1 year after he had joined the monastery, so in August of 1951 now, Blessed János was able to make his first vows, his temporary vows. Having completed the novitiate in a secret way, he was ready now to formally offer his life for a time of discernment still. But because the abbot, Abbot Wendel, had been put into prison, the one who received his vows was Father Lawrence. Also in 1951, the communist authorities had established a particular agency that would oversee the governance of the church. These agents of the Communist Party were known as mustache bishops, or representatives of the government that would control the life of the faithful by commanding their superiors to appoint priests here and not there, by deciding who would or would not be advanced to different offices. It was in this time that János ended up becoming a priest. János's path to the priesthood, however, could not be taken for granted at that time. When these mustache bishops assumed control over the governance of the church, they restricted much. They closed several seminaries, reducing ultimately the diocesan seminaries from 13 to 5, combining some and just outright closing others. And they determined that anyone who had formerly been a religious would not be allowed to continue his formation to become a priest, even through the diocese. And so János, like many other religious, had to keep his identity a secret. Unfortunately, because his first profession was made in secret, there was no official public documentation to that effect. And so when some members of the seminary, some seminarians, were dismissed because they had entered after having been known publicly to have been members of religious orders, János was able secretly to remain in the seminary. In fact, many of his brother seminarians didn't know that he was a Cistercian monk. The rector of the seminary where he eventually pursued the priesthood told him and anyone else who was a religious to keep their identity a secret. They were allowed to communicate with their religious superiors, but had to do so very carefully through letter. And Father Lawrence, in fact, whenever he would write John Brenner, wouldn't sign his name. He just wrote M for magister, or teacher, and he wouldn't date the letters either. All efforts to try to keep their association and their identity a secret. János had originally entered a diocesan seminary in Szombathely, but that was closed, and so he and many other seminarians were transferred to another seminary in Győr. And in Győr, János was, I'm sure happily, joined by his two brothers. Again, all three boys in the Brenner family, all three children of Joseph and Juliana, became priests. There in Győr, all three Brenner boys studied and enjoyed their life together. János was, again, a very intelligent and good student, also a very spiritual, well-respected, serious but happy person. And so he was eventually promoted to a position of leadership within the seminary community. In his fourth year, he was something of a dean for the younger seminarians. And we have a very beautiful address that he gave to them at the end of a year of their time together. I want to now read from this long citation because I find it has many beautiful lessons about community life and the essence of our life as Christians. János begins with a declaration about what it means to be a human being. Despite all other views to the contrary, God created the human being for love. Love is His homeland, His holiness, but also His measuring stick. Love's base is the community. Therefore, God conceived the human being as a being for community, so that His personality might open up, so that He might transcend Himself, and so that men might find each other. In this way, they become the image of the Trinitarian God. This is a beautiful declaration of the Church's faith, that God made human beings in His own image, and that means He makes them essentially relational, as beings ordered toward others. It's not an option whether or not we will live for love. If we want to find fulfillment and happiness in this life, we must live for love. It's love or bust. We are essentially communal because we are made in God's image. We are made as the kind of creature that wants to go outside of itself to find itself, to lose its life in order to save it. Blessed János continues, now with an exhortation and an examination of conscience based on our identity as human beings, as creatures made for love. We have spent a year together. How was our community? How were our encounters? There are encounters of various kinds. There are encounters in business. People start a business and with it pursue profit. We call this a relationship of mutual utility. Then we meet human beings on the street. Perhaps an image of them remains with us, or not. We meet the conductor at the train station. Perhaps we even experience something with him and exchange a few words. but our soul remains unmoved. We say goodbye forever and think perhaps never again about him. But there are other encounters in which something deep in the soul comes to be moved. A voice resounds. Invisible bonds are tied. A timeless relationship emerges between soul and soul. That is the ruling force pushing toward the goal. These relationships are very deep, and they are for a lifetime. Who can say why? A young man meets a priest, and in the depths of his soul, he feels something. That's it. Two young people look each other in the eyes. They understand each other and listen to each other. That's it. Why? Why do such life and death friendships arise? It's a beautiful reflection, and we can all use it to reflect upon our own encounters. How do we meet others? Of course, not every meeting with another person is going to be as rich and soul-moving as the next, but we should be looking for those. If it's true that we're made for deep relationships of love, we should be open to those relationships. We should be moving about in this world with the expectation that God, through another person, would touch our soul, and that there would be a moment of recognition. That's it. That's what I'm here on this earth for. This is the relationship through which God wills for me to give away my life in love so that I might find it for eternity. János imagines here a young man meeting a priest and finding in that relationship a father and son, a key to his own life of love. He also imagines two people, a man and a woman perhaps, who meet each other and enact there a bond of friendship that gives their life meaning, probably through marriage or through any form of friendship that endures and occasions true sacrifice and love. János now turns his attention specifically to the examination of conscience for those seminarians who are gathered and listening to him. We have spent a year near each other. Did we manage to do more than live near each other? How was our encounter? Did we look past each other, or did we learn how to look each other in the eye, and even with the other to look in the same direction? Have we found each other? Have we found love? In the school of life, love is in fact the main subject. Reflect and draw up your balance sheets for the year. You will find much that is good, but also mistakes. For the mistakes, may you ask God for forgiveness with a humble heart. And for what is good, may you give credit only to God. Guard yourselves from the spirit of pride and of self-conceit, since that spirit is the greatest obstacle to love. And since in reality we are all miserable, wretched, and guilty human beings, the good Lord is so humble. He does the good thing, and it seems as if human beings were the ones who did it. We too should be so humble. Humility is truth, that we confess that everything belongs to God. It's a powerful examination of conscience here that, again, we all can make. How are our encounters? Do we look people in the eye? Are we able really to be open to them? Can we acknowledge our mistakes? Do we give God the glory when He works something beautiful in our lives? To be sure, a proper understanding of faith and works doesn't deny the role of human freedom in every act of virtue. But it's also not blind to the fact that apart from God's help, God's grace, we wouldn't enjoy the excellence that we do. He is to be given credit for every good thing we enjoy. Do we give Him credit? Do we have prayers of thanksgiving? Finally, János closes, if you feel that we were hard, harder than others, accept this too in love, since this also happened for you. Perhaps you do not yet understand that, but the good Lord will explain it for you. In the seminary, our vocations should be tested. If it always goes nicely for us, what guarantee do we have that we are really seeking God and not just a comfortable life? But if we remain faithful in trials, then the call of God is really working in us. I thank you for your readiness. When I asked you for something, you have never refused it. Pray for me in order that through holy ordination, I will become a more faithful servant of God until the end of my life. Those words reflect a man who wants to grow through all things and who is ready to embrace trials, even very difficult ones, for the fruit that they can bring. Anyone who suffered well knows that purification can happen, where it becomes more and more possible for us to live and to know that we live for God's sake and not for the sake of our own wills or comforts or private desires. When things don't go our way, but we persevere cheerfully nonetheless, confident that God in His providence is arranging all things for the good of those who love Him, we grow and we show to ourselves and others that we are living for the highest motive, for love, for obedience to God, and a readiness to do His will. In 1955, Blessed János is ordained a priest, and he takes as his motto, or the verse that's written on his holy card at his ordination, Romans 8:28, that all things work for the good of those who love God. He's able to serve as a priest for about 2.5 years. He's known by those in the parish where he serves as a very pious, good, kind young man. He has a very good, healthy relationship with the pastor. János is something like an assistant pastor there. And people describe them as a kind of father-son pair. János would often go to the devotions and the celebrations in the parish community, even when he wasn't the one presiding, when the pastor would preside. I find that to be a very beautiful and heroic detail. I know as a priest, it could sometimes be very difficult to attend so many different things. And the ones you attend are sometimes only the ones you're responsible for. And of course, you can pray there too. But I'm edified as a priest to know that János went even to those things at which he was not the presider, where his only motive was simply to be a member of the faithful and to pray. János was known as a very committed priest, as someone who lived with a sense of clear purpose. He was known as someone who was very good with the young. He would play sports with them often. János was known as somebody who could speak to just about anyone and offer them an encouraging word. Here are some of the testimonials about Blessed János by those who knew him. One of the faithful testifies, "What János did, he did conscientiously and deliberately, whatever it was. What he did with heart and soul." Another says, "The secret of his popularity is that he honored everyone the same, that he loved everyone the same. He had a good word for everyone, no matter who it was." Another says, "He could speak to each person in his own language, but he felt best with the young. He liked to play sports and he played soccer well." Another says, "Most especially his look marked him, by which you could tell that he had a clear conscience." Another testifies to the experience of Blessed János in confession. "In the confessional, I always had the feeling as if he could see into me and read my conscience. In a sense, he was a strict confessor, as is expected by those who take confession seriously. And he always gave the right instructions and supports. Confession with him was an experience. I experienced then that I had been cleansed. Something radiated from him." And finally, another testifies, "He had something in himself that attracted people, the readiness to serve, the love, about which he didn't just speak, but rather also lived." János was ready to serve and to remain in a position of a servant even when times were difficult. In 1956, when the Hungarian Revolution took place, and for a few weeks the border with Austria was opened, János and others visited the border. János turned around and went back home to his parish, and he had the sense, and he wrote in his journal, that it is still too early to rejoice. In his diary, he also wrote the following words, "My Lord, you know that I am not seeking happiness here on earth. I have placed everything on you. I know that you do not spare your own from suffering, since they receive from it eternal rewards." Blessed János was increasingly aware of the costs of such priestly service, and he was ready to embrace those costs. In 1957, the mustache bishops had decided they'd had enough of Blessed János. János was just too effective as a priest. In fact, one of the local communist officials, his children wanted to attend the catechism classes of Blessed János. But of course, that father wouldn't allow them to do so, since he was a communist. And so János told the children that he will stand by an open window and speak loudly enough such that the kids could be outside the building and still hear what he was teaching. So effective was János. In any event, the mustache bishops decided that they wanted to remove him from his position in order to decrease his effect. So they told his bishop to reassign him. The bishop summons János and says, "They want me to reassign you." And János says, "I'm not afraid. I can stay happily." And so János stays. And the mustache bishop says to the real bishop, "Fine, you will see the consequences." Shortly afterward, there was a first attempt on János's life. János was driving home on a motorcycle, and some people on the side of the road threw wooden blocks into the road in order to try to cause an accident. János successfully swerved around them and arrived home. But his awareness that things are getting even more serious is, of course, increasing. Then, one fateful night on December 14th, just before the third Sunday of Advent, János is sleeping in the rectory when a young man, aged 17, a man named Tibor, knocks on the door. János descends and opens the door, and Tibor says that his uncle was dying and needed someone to bring the viaticum and administer the last rites. János, a zealous priest, says of course, gets his articles, stole surplus, gets the Eucharist from the tabernacle, and in midnight enters into the darkness, initially following Tibor. Tibor then, according to his testimony later, says that he had to go home and János had to proceed alone to his uncle's home. And so János continues in the middle of the night, all by himself, taking a path over a hill in a darkly wooded area. Around 2 a.m, neighbors in the village testified to hearing a young man shouting, calling for help. János was being attacked. He was jumped by several men and stabbed 32 times. When his body was found, his left hand was still clutching the Eucharist. This arm had a number of stab wounds. His right arm was relatively less wounded, and it seems to have been the arm with which he defended himself with the flashlight for as long as he had it. János's body was brutally beaten, but it remained fixated on the Eucharist. The story from this point could continue, with an explanation of the various investigations and the very shoddy attempts of the officials to try to find who had murdered him. But that's not worth telling at this point. What I would like to focus on is the edifying man, Blessed János Brenner. And to fill in the picture a little more fully, I'm going to interpret now this icon, which is here in the monastery as a gift from a generous benefactor, and eloquently tells the story of János. First, you have János' stolen surplice, which he was wearing the night he was murdered. It's a sign of his priestly zeal and service that János wanted to give himself away entirely as a servant, in the middle of the night, ready to go up and serve an allegedly dying man. János is also pictured here with a cross, which in Eastern iconography would often signal that the figure is a martyr. On the cross are the words ardere et lucere. Those are Latin words. They come ultimately from a passage in the Gospel of John, where Jesus describes John the Baptist as a lamp burning and shining. Those words, burning and shining, have become the motto of the Cistercian congregation of Zeerts. Saint Bernard of Clairvaux spoke of that phrase, burning and shining, or ardere et lucere, as a motto for Christian life, where we must seek first and foremost to be internally aflame, filled with zeal, devotion, passion for the love of God. No matter what happens all around us, this interior flame must be lit. That fire of the heart must be burning. And then by God's providence, it will in various ways illuminate. It will enlighten. Lucere. Blessed János, to be sure, lived with the ardere, and in the measure that providence gave him, suffering under a communist regime, it was an immense lucere as well. Beneath the stolen surplice, you can see the collar of the Cistercian in Hungary. It's much like my collar here. János at this time would not have been wearing such a habit. The artist here has taken some license in order to illustrate the complexity of János's identity. He was ordained as a diocesan priest, but always remained interiorly with the heart of a monk. And so he has both the cassock of a diocesan priest peeking out of his sleeves here, but he also has the monastic collar of the congregation of Zeerts. János lived with an intense awareness of his vocation as a monk, to give his life away entirely in obedience to God. Here are some beautiful words from his journal. This is a prayer to God. I ask you only one thing. May I always fulfill most precisely what you give to me as my vocation. Whether you assign me a leadership position or a humble one, let me follow your footsteps everywhere and accept my task from your loving, caring hands with the humble heart of a child. Would that we all could live with such simplicity and trust in the providence of God and follow our vocations, whatever they might be. In the center is the Eucharist, held up artistically by the left hand of János. The artist has depicted János' body slightly moving outward with the left shoulder, as if offering the Eucharist. It's placed in a position above his heart, suggesting how János' ardere was animated by the Sacred Heart of Christ, by the self-giving love of Christ left in the Eucharist. Here is another beautiful excerpt from his journal, illustrating the Eucharistic zeal with which he wanted to live. On the stone wall of the bastion of my life stands written this sentence, under all circumstances, let your holy will be done. Take my will, my heart, my all, and give me the grace that I may be fully transformed into Christ. For this is my vocation, to burn, to be aflame in your love for sinners. I grab with both hands and eagerly swallow the cup of sufferings that Christ gives me, for my life must mirror your life. János wanted to be transformed into what he consumed from the altar at Mass. Catholics believe that the Eucharist is the representation of Christ's self-offering on the cross. That mind, that heart, that body, that full human life that Christ gave to the Father in perfect love is meant by God's design to become our nourishment, to help us become not just like Christ, but to be born again in Christ as a very member of his body. János wanted that, and he offered his life accordingly, on the altar at every Mass, and in priestly service to the point of martyrdom. At the bottom is a very small white heart, reflecting the white-hot fire of the Sacred Heart. That God's heart burns for love of sinners, for love of those who suffer all kinds of poverty, material, spiritual, moral, whatever it might be. Any human misery draws down upon it God's mercy. That white-hot, burning love of God, that desire, that intense desire to dwell among us, to heal us and raise us. That was János' ideal. And János, though declared blessed by the Church, knew himself to be very much a pilgrim, and so saw how there was still a gap between his own heart and the heart to which he aspired, the heart of Christ. I take this as a very consoling word now from János' journal, that he too, such a holy priest, was willing to recognize himself as a pilgrim, as someone who still had room to grow in the zeal and holiness that he sought. Here's what he wrote in his journal. To burn in the fire, I saw a long corridor in a dream, which was gradually glowing hotter and hotter, but where I was standing it was black and cold. At the end of the corridor, there was a flaming heart upon a white-hot glowing throne. I understood from this that the heart of Jesus is Lord above all, and that I am still far away from the true love of his most holy heart. Oh, blessed are those who have reached the throne and have been burned away. How blessed it is that János not only burned with zeal, but he also burned to burn. That is, he longed for the righteousness that still lay before him. May we all be inspired by his heroic life and death to pursue our vocations with every ounce of trust and docility that we can muster. And may we, like János, seek to make the heart of Christ our own by attending Mass, laying ourselves upon the altar, letting Christ himself fill us through the Eucharist, so that his life may truly become our own. May Blessed János Brenner and all the saints united to Christ intercede for us, that we might live here lives of peace under governments that respect the authority of God, and that we might all find our vocations and live them with the same heroism that he did. Blessed János, pray for us.